Law at Work is sponsored by Perrett van Niekerk Woodhouse Macholo, leading labour law specialists representing businesses throughout South and Southern Africa, as well as Case Law, the quick, fast and easy labour law search engine.
Hello, I'm Simon Colman and welcome to the Law at Work. The issue of child labour is often perceived as an issue that only occurs outside our borders. A recent case in KZN tells us otherwise. With me in the studio to shed some light on this is Dawie Bosch of the TECL. Welcome, Dawie.
Hi.
Dawie, perhaps you could just fill in a little bit of detail about the TECL. What exactly is it?
It stands for the Program Towards the Elimination of Child Labour, and it's a joint program between the South African government and the International Labour Organization. It has really been put in place after the adoption of the Child Labour Program of Action in 2003 to start a process of helping government really to implement the Child Labour Program of Action.
I have to say, when I read the article, I was quite shocked. I think many people at home probably also feel this is something that only happens, say, in Asia or elsewhere around the world. Can you give us some of the facts around this case?
Well, the first thing is it is probably true that the extent and the exploitative nature of child labour in South Africa may be less than some other developing countries. That certainly looks like correct. However, when we look at the figures, and the most recent study shows us that at the national level there are more than 800,000 children doing work that from a statistical point of view appears to be causing them some harm.
Define a child.
Child is a person under the age of 18, and child labour is work that is detrimental to the child. That type of work could include employment, which is maybe what your program deals mainly with, but also other kinds of work where that work is detrimental to the child. For example, if a child has lost its parents because of HIV/AIDS, for example, and that child has to fend for themselves, they can't go to school and they have to find some way of income, that is considered to be a form of child labour, even if it does not involve working for somebody else.
This is a very tricky situation, obviously, because these are children or people that need to fend for themselves and they're precluded from doing so. How are we dealing with that in South Africa?
Well, the challenge is to stop the exploitative nature because of people that maybe even for themselves they may be thinking they're helping children.
Yes.
But in reality are using the situation to get work done for much less than they would have paid an adult.
Right.
So basically exploiting children.
Right.
That happens even within extended families where we have the systems in South Africa practice where extended families would look after kids if parents were to pass away. But if those extended family members then expect the child to do more than they would expect of their own children and actually become the family domestic worker or at worst case the domestic slave, that clearly is inappropriate and it's even if it were to be a custom, it's not an acceptable custom.
In the case in KwaZulu-Natal, somebody was obviously found guilty of this offence. Is that dealt with in a civil court or a criminal court? How is it?
That was criminal. Basically, we divide in the Child Labour Program of Action issues for intervention in broadly two categories. The one is where enforcement and the law is relatively paramount.
Right.
In formal employment context, there's a prohibition of employment of children up to the end of the year in which they turn 15. And where somebody breaks the law there, prosecution is certainly an option that the Department of Labour and the inspectors would be looking at.
So this is the Department of Labour that drives this. It's not something, say, the South African police would get involved in, or is it a joint?
Well, obviously a prosecution is something that must be run through the ordinary courts and criminal courts, and the criminal courts would be run through a prosecutor and Department of Justice type of machinery. But the liaison is between the labour inspector and the prosecuting services. Obviously, police plays a role because they're usually the investigators. But in this case, the main investigation would be done by the labour inspector, and then the prosecution through the prosecutor.
what happened to the child in this case?
Well, that is the important and interesting part
Yes.
of this case, and it illustrates really how the Child Labour Programme of Action is set to put in place. To stop the employment of a child without looking at the welfare and the interest of the child will be counterproductive. And
You're just treating a symptom rather than the problem.
Absolutely. And not only that, you may force that child into more exploitative work, because
Yes.
now the child must now find another employer. And because of hearing about this case, the kind of employer may be one that's even more exploitative, or push the child
Yes.
into illegal
Yes.
activities, getting into crime and things like that.
Yes.
So there is no solution. The solution of just prosecuting or taking employers on as if they are transgressors as the main strategy is not the right approach.
Right.
Certainly where there is abuse. In this case, the employer did not pay the child for a long period of time. It was more than just that the child was employed.
Yes.
And secondly, the child was not at school and was 14 years old. That child is by law supposed to be at
Yes,
school.
yes.
And the employer used the vulnerability of this child not being at school
Yes.
as a way of, in fact, getting work done for much less. And that, in this case, prosecution was appropriate. Whether the sentence of a suspended sentence, as was in this case, was appropriate, that I leave to the court, because the court heard all the circumstances.
Yes.
But the fact of the matter is, if there is real exploitation and, in a sense, abuse of the situation,
Yes.
as it appears to in this case, a suspended sentence is not the only option.
Yes.
Obviously, charging the employer for fining or
This needs to be a deterrent,
it
clearly.
needs to be a significant deterrent.
Yes. What industry did this take place in?
This was in retail. The child was used in kind of relatively informal retail, was
Yes.
selling clothes and cakes and things. And that you we often see kids involved in that. Where a child is working as part of a kind of family survival strategy directly,
Yes.
that would still be against the law.
Yes.
But the solution of prosecution is inappropriate,
Yes.
because it's the poverty of the family that probably will lead to that.
Absolutely. I'm just thinking, I've noticed a lot of children standing on the side of the road selling little trinkets and things like that. So is this restricted to specific industries, or are we talking about a fairly widespread problem here in South Africa?
Well, widespread to some extent, as I've indicated earlier, but when
Yeah.
we talk about the formal sector is relatively, you don't get that too
Yes.
often. The main industries where you find it in formal sector is retail, like this case, although
Yes.
this was more informal side of retail, and secondly, commercial agriculture. Domestic work is another big category, but whether that's formal or informal is, it's
Yes.
a bit of a debate.
Yes.
But when we talk about ordinary employers, it is primarily farmers and businessmen selling goods.
And that's quite a difficult area to monitor as well. I mean, you're talking about huge geographical distances, things like that.
Absolutely. Well, a very important part of this is working together with business. And Business South Africa has been very active
Yes.
in the strategy, with the representation in the different bodies and so on. When it comes to the main impact from the business side,
Yes.
is actually them carrying the message to their members. In other words, to make sure that people are clear that a child up to the age of 15 must be at school, and after the age of 15 the law says the child can be working, but the work must not be hazardous. So there are new regulations the Department of Labour has been working on. It should be issued within the next 6 months, that then will specify where a child could be working. Of course, the point is that young people do need to learn
Yes.
responsibility, need to learn skill, and both of those things often link to the issue of work. So household chores, when children are under the age of 15, other kind of work-related activities at school where it is not exploitative and inappropriate.
That's
certainly.
the key, the exploitative nature of it.
That's right. But
Excellent.
over 15, that's where kids need to be introduced to the area of work.
Yes.
Many of us, when we were
Yes.
that age, started doing odd jobs here and there, and that is correct,
Right.
as long as the kid is over 15
Okay.
and the safety is in place.
Dawie, thank you very much for joining me in the studio. I appreciate it. And to you at home, goodbye.
Law at Work is sponsored by Perrett van Niekerk Woodhouse Macholo, leading labour law specialists representing businesses throughout South and Southern Africa, as well as Case Law, the quick, fast and easy labour law search engine. South and Southern Africa, as well as Case Law, the quick, fast and easy labour law search engine.